In April 1968, 30 industrialists gathered in Rome to discuss the subject of staggering scope, the present and future problems confronting mankind. Out of this meeting grew the Club of Rome, an informal organization with a membership representing 25 nationalities. None of its members hold public office, nor does the group express any political point of view. All are united, however, by an overriding conviction that the major problems facing mankind are of such complexity and are so interrelated that traditional institutions and policies are no longer able to cope with them. A series of early meetings of the Club of Rome culminated in the decision to initiate a remarkably ambitious undertaking, the project of the predicament of mankind. The intent of the project was to examine problems troubling the people of all nations: poverty, pollution, loss of faith in institutions, uncontrolled urban spread, insecurity of unemployment, alienation of youth, rejection of traditional values, and monetary and economic disruptions. These problems have three common characteristics. They occur to some degree in all countries. They contain technical, political, social, and economic elements, and they interact. Early in 1969, an internationally prominent group of specialists was assembled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to study the relationships of the 5 physical factors that determine and can ultimately limit growth on this planet: population, agricultural production, natural resources, industrial production, and pollution. The group constructed a complex computer model of the world capable of simulating the interactions of these 5 factors. They found that all 5 elements are increasing at exponential rates, and that while nearly all of mankind's current activities, from the use of fertilizers to the expansion of cities, are represented by exponential growth, most people are accustomed to thinking of growth as a linear process. The difference is this: linear growth occurs when a quantity increases by a constant amount in a constant time period. On a graph, it looks like this. Exponential growth, on the other hand, is a quantity that increases by a percentage of the whole in a constant time period, and looks like this. Exponential growth is deceptive because it generates immense numbers very quickly. A familiar story, said to have originated in Persia, offers a classic example of exponential growth. The story tells of a clever courtier who presented a beautiful chess set to his king, and in return asked only that the king give him 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard, 2 grains for the second square, 4 for the third, and so on. The king, not being mathematically inclined, agreed and ordered the rice brought forth. The 8th square required 128 grains. The 12th took more than 1 pound. Long before reaching the 64th square, the king's coffers were depleted. Even today, the world's richest king could not produce enough rice to fill the final square. It would take more than 200 billion tons to fill it, which is equivalent to the total world production of rice for 653 years. Another story, a French children's story, tells about a man who noticed a lily plant growing in his pond. The next day, he saw 2 lily pads, and the next day, 4. He realized that the lily pads were doubling in number once a day. He thought to himself that while the lily pads were nice, he would take care that they didn't increase to the point where other life in the pond would be choked out. A month or so later, he looked at his pond and saw that it was half covered with lily pads, and decided it was about time to do something about them. At which point, he realized that he had only 1 day in which to save his pond. The lily pads increased exponentially because of a serious imbalance between positive and negative feedback loops. No lily pads were dying, only new ones were growing. In a balanced situation, feedback loops have much the same function as a home thermostat, which turns the furnace on when the temperature drops and turns it off when the desired temperature is reached. Population feedback loops, as seen here, are unbalanced because the positive birth loop dominates the negative death loop, assuring continued population growth. This imbalance is a result of medical technology that has increased life expectancy and decreased infant mortality rates. Feedback loops for industrial output again show the positive capital investment loop dominating the negative depreciation loop. Exponential growth is a function of all 5 physical elements that can limit expansion in the world, because in every case, the positive loops dominate the negative loops. The five quantities, population, food, industrial production, resources, and pollution, are joined by interrelationships between feedback loops that should be identified. As might be expected, each is interrelated to the other as seen here. The model is a total world model based on a matrix of precise mathematical formulas. It was designed so that a change in any one element causes proportionate changes over time in all other elements. After 3 years of testing, the designers finally felt they had a reliable tool. The purpose of the model is to determine the broad, long-term behavior tendencies of the five physical elements when they are contained in a closed dynamic system. There are 4 general tendencies or behavior modes that can happen given the system as it exists. The first is a gradual approach to the ultimate carrying capacity of the Earth and a smooth adjustment to an equilibrium just below the physical limit. Second, it can overshoot the limit, then die back again in a smooth manner. Third, it can overshoot and die back to a series of oscillations. Finally, it is possible to overshoot the ultimate carrying capacity so severely that in the process the upper limit is decreased because of consumption of non-renewable resources. This last behavior mode has been observed in natural systems. For example, deer and goats, when natural enemies are absent, overgraze their range to such an extent that erosion destroys vegetation, reducing the total carrying capacity of the land. Man does no better. For example, in the whaling industry, since 1945, catcher boats have become bigger and more powerful. But their efficiency has plummeted. Why? Because as wild herds of whales have been destroyed, finding the survivors has become more difficult and has required more effort. As larger whales are killed off, smaller species are exploited to keep the industry alive. First, they killed off the biggest whales, the blues. Then, as stocks gave out, they switched to killing the smaller fin whales. As fin stocks were depleted, they switched to the smaller sei whales. And now, as the sei stocks collapse, the smaller sperm whale is being hunted. There have never been species limits, so the larger whales are still taken whenever encountered. The situation is one where the smaller whales are used to subsidize the extermination of large ones. The ultimate folly. Notice that whaling virtually ceased during World War II. A time of turmoil for people was a time of peace for whales. And who is the largest industrial user of whale oil in the U.S.? The cosmetics industry. There is general agreement that 1/3, or about 1 billion of the world's total population, are greatly undernourished or actually starving. While total food production is increasing, per capita food production in the underdeveloped areas of the world is at best just barely keeping pace at its present inadequate level with population growth. Starving Calcutta residents who live in the streets and have virtually nothing left to lose but their lives are typical of many people in other areas of the world. The primary natural resource necessary for producing food is land. The total world land mass is about 37 billion acres. 82% is totally incapable of supporting cultivation. 9%, the richest, most accessible land, is already under cultivation. The remaining 9% is all that has any productive potential whatever. This last 9% will require increasingly large amounts of capital to reach, clear, irrigate, and fertilize before it too can become productive. Recent costs for developing new land has ranged as high as $2,000 per acre. In some parts of the world where expansion is theoretically possible, the costs may be so high that it will be more economical to intensify utilization of existing areas. Assume that the people of the world decide to pay the high cost to develop all possible arable land. Assume that no arable land will be used for non-agricultural purposes. And finally, assume that the present world average of 0.9 acres of land is needed to sustain each person, although the present average for each person in the U.S. is 2.2 acres, more than double the world average. If these assumptions are made, when can we expect to run out of the land that will grow food for an exponentially increasing population? Far sooner than most people would guess. This graph shows how you can go from feast to famine in a very short period of time. By doubling agricultural yields, the crisis is delayed only 30 years. A similar graph can be drawn for the total world supply of fresh water. 97% of the world's water is salt water. The remaining 3% is fresh water. Of the fresh water in the world, 98% is tied up in ice caps at the poles. In some areas, the limit of fresh water will be reached long before all arable land is utilized. As you might expect, the U.S. leads all other countries with a raw water usage rate of 1,700 gallons per capita per day. We cannot possibly drink that much, you see. Indirectly, we do. For example, it takes more than 100,000 gallons of water to manufacture a single automobile. Opening new farmland, farming the sea, expanding use of fertilizers and pesticides, desalinization of seawater will all require an increase in capital expenditures devoted to food production. Land and water are renewable resources, but the equipment necessary to cultivate the land uses up non-renewable resources such as metals and fuels. Thus, the expansion of food production in the future is very much dependent on the availability of non-renewable resources. So we come to the question, what are the limits to the Earth's supply of natural resources? The current usage rate for every natural resource is growing exponentially. For many resources, the usage rate is growing faster than the population, indicating that not only are more people consuming resources, but the average rate of consumption per person is increasing each year. Another important factor that is relevant to resource usage is the manner in which industry reports known reserves of natural resources. Known resources are expressed in terms of amounts available for future use, given a constant rate of consumption at the current level. This disregards the evidence that all resources are being used up at an exponentially increasing rate. The coal industry lists known reserves as a 2,300-year supply at the current rate of use. If the known exponential rate of increasing usage is considered, then reserves of coal are good for only 111 years. Similarly, a reported 240-year known reserve for iron is actually 93 years. Applying the exponential index to some other resources gives us reserves of aluminum, 31 years, tungsten, 28 years, copper, 21 years, natural gas, 22 years, petroleum, 20 years, lead and zinc, 19 years, tin, 15 years, mercury, 13 years, gold, 9 years. Even if all known reserves are doubled, they would still last on the average only an additional 20 years. Given present resource consumption rate and the projected increase in these rates, the great majority of the currently important non-renewable resources will be extremely costly 100 years from now. This statement remains true regardless of the most optimistic assumptions about undiscovered reserves. Compounding the problem of economics of other natural resources is the problem of politics. The recent nationalization of South American mines and the successful pressure by Middle Eastern countries to raise oil prices indicates that the political question may take precedent long before the ultimate economic one. What happens to the metals and fuels that are extracted from the earth after they have been discarded? The natural ecological system can absorb many of the effluents of human activities and process them into substances that are usable by, or at least harmless to, other forms of life. However, the wastes of human civilization can and have accumulated in the environment until they are visible, annoying, and even harmful. Mercury in fish, DDT in birds, lead in city air, oil slicks on beaches, mountains of urban trash are all the result of an increasing flow of resources into and out of man's hands. It is little wonder, then, that another exponentially increasing quantity in the world system is pollution. Although long-term pollution data are not as readily available as other types of data, the evidence is that virtually every pollutant that has been measured is increasing exponentially. Let's begin by looking at the pollutants related to mankind's increasing use of energy. Per capita energy consumption in the world is increasing by 1.3% per year. Combined with a population growth of 2.1%, this gives a total increase of 3.4% per year. This means that energy consumption is doubling every 23 years. At present, 97% of man's energy is produced by consuming fossil fuels, which release, among other substances, carbon dioxide, CO2. Atmospheric concentrations of CO2 observed since 1958 at Mauna Loa, Hawaii, have verified computer model indications that the concentrations are increasing exponentially. Another byproduct of energy production is heat. Waste heat released in Los Angeles and Gary, Indiana, is already altering local climates. Nuclear power will produce yet another kind of pollutant, radioactive waste. As installed nuclear generation capacity increases, so does the amount of stored and released nuclear waste. To gain an idea of what can be expected in the future regarding these pollutants, this This graph takes the currently allowable release standards as set by the Atomic Energy Commission and multiplies that by the projected installed capacity of nuclear generators up to the year 2000. This figure is for U.S. requirements only. For some other forms of pollution, actual observed data are available. Recent historical data for Lake Ontario, not Lake Erie, which you have heard so much about, but Lake Ontario, show a continuing exponential increase in the amount of dissolved solids. At the same time, amounts of fish taken from the lake continue to decrease. This phenomenon is not unique to the U.S. Here is the rate of oxygen depletion of the Baltic Sea, and here is the lead content in the Greenland ice cap. One critical factor typical of all types of pollution is the natural long-term delay that occurs between the time that a pollutant is first introduced into the environment and the appearance of its negative effect on the ecosystem. An example of this delay can be seen in data on the chemical pesticide DDT. This graph shows what would happen if in 1970 the world DDT application rate began to decrease gradually, which it has. Because of the inherent delays in the system, the level of DDT in fish continues to rise for 11 years after use starts declining, and the level in fish does not come back down to the 1970 level until the year 1995, more than 20 years later. So not only is there a natural delay from the time of release to the time of harmful appearance, there is an additional delay from the time controls are instituted to the time the harmful effect finally decreases. Any pollution control system based on establishing controls only when some harm is already detected will guarantee that the problem will get worse before it gets better. By now it should be clear that all of these problems arise from one simple fact. The Earth is not infinite. It is finite. The conclusion from these findings is one that many perceptive people have already realized, and that is that the short doubling times of many of man's activities combined with the immense quantities being doubled will bring us close to the Earth's limits to growth surprisingly soon. In addition to the 5 physical elements, there is a second set of ingredients that affects world growth, and they are the social elements. The most important being social stability, levels of education and employment, types of social values and beliefs. These social factors are much more difficult to assess or predict, and this mathematical model does not deal with them explicitly. The designers of the model chose the conservative approach of assuming that the best possible social conditions will prevail. With this assumption, however tenuous it may be, they were then ready to have the computer answer the basic questions. How much growth will the physical system support? What will be the most likely behavior mode as the exponential growth continues? And what happens when attempted controls are instituted? First, let's look at the standard run. The standard run of the world model assumes no major change in physical, economic, or social relationships that have historically governed the development of our present world system. All variables plotted here are merely extensions of the trends established from 1900 through 1970. Food, industrial output, and population grow exponentially until a rapidly diminishing resource base forces reductions in industrial growth. Because of natural delays in the system, both population and pollution continue to increase for some time after the peak of industrialization. Population growth is finally halted by a rise in the death rate due to lack of food and medical services. The behavior mode is clearly that of overshoot and collapse. In this run, collapse occurs because of depletion of non-renewable resources. Therefore, it can be said with some confidence that if no major changes occur in our present system, population and industrial growth will certainly collapse within the next century at the latest. Several additional points about this conclusion should be noted. First, in all instances where data were doubtful, inconsistent, or unavailable, the most optimistic estimates were incorporated into the model. For example, as mentioned earlier, worldwide pollution data are unavailable or sketchy at best, so appropriate extrapolations have been made from local data using a linear multiplier for these projections, not exponential, as would probably be the case. Also, as mentioned earlier, the model ignores discontinuous events such as wars or epidemics which might bring about the end of growth even sooner. The model then is biased to allow growth to continue longer than would probably be the case in the real world. Also, there has been no attempt to calculate the impact at any point in time of social action, or more likely social reaction, to any of the plotted events. The standard run collapses because of a resource crisis. Being more optimistic, the computer was then programmed to assume that new discoveries or advances in technology could conceivably double the economically available resources. Now, industrialization reaches even higher levels. However, pollution is released at such a rate that the environmental absorption mechanisms become saturated. The rise in pollution causes a decrease in food production and a rapid rise in the world death rate. At the end of the run, natural resources are severely depleted in spite of doubling the original amount available. One of the most persuasive arguments that is brought forth to counter doomsday prophecies is that new technology will make future restrictions unnecessary, that such technological advances as the green revolution, farming the sea, and use of solar or geothermal energy are soon to be realities that will make continued growth possible. By applying such technological optimism to the model, it can be assumed that unlimited energy might provide access to unlimited natural resources. But as this computer run indicates, curbs on pollution are a must if a collapse is to be avoided. Now, it is likely that a world society that has unlimited energy would also be able to afford strict pollution controls using technological means. Strict, but not complete control. A reduction to less than 1/4 of the present rate of pollution is probably unrealistic economically and is most certainly unrealistic given our present political institutions. However, for this model run, strict pollution controls are set at 1/4 the current rate starting in 1975. This time, population and industry grow until the limit of arable land is reached, and then collapse occurs because of lack of food. Now, the problem is clearly either too many people or too little food. Incidentally, the equations used to determine world food production in the graph so far displayed includes the impact of the so-called green revolution. And as you have seen, the total positive effect, if any, is negligible. From 1951 through 1966, the Green Revolution achieved a 34% increase in agricultural production. However, achieving that gain was the result of a 63% increase in equipment, a 147% increase in the use of fertilizers, and a 300% increase in the use of pesticides. To produce another 34% increase over the next 15 years, which would not even maintain the existing inadequate level of food production, will require even greater increases in equipment, fertilizers, and pesticides. However, to avoid the food crisis of the previous run and using U.S. productivity, which is the highest in the world, as a base, the next computer run was programmed for a doubled world agricultural production rate beginning in 1975. Unlimited resources and strict pollution controls are still in effect. The combination of these policies removes so many constraints that population and industry reach very high levels. While each unit of production produces pollution at only 1/4 the present level, total production rises so high that it still creates a pollution crisis that brings an end to growth. This leaves us with only one element left to manipulate: population. In the next run, the computer is told that worldwide birth control preventing the births of unwanted children is initiated in 1975. Also, 75% of the natural resources consumed are recycled. Strict pollution controls and double agricultural yields are still in effect. The result is a temporary achievement of a constant population, while the world average income per capita nearly reaches the present U.S. level. Finally, collapse in this case occurs as resources are depleted, pollution accumulates, and food production declines, followed by a rise in the death rate. If we believe that growth should not be deliberately limited but should be left to seek its own level, the most likely behavior mode of the world system is exponential growth, followed by collapse. The basic question is then, is it better to try to live within self-imposed limits that restrict growth, or is it preferable to allow growth to continue until some other natural limit arises, in the hope that by that time new technology will allow growth to reach even greater heights? Technological optimism is the most common and least founded reaction to the findings of this world model. Continued faith in technological solutions to the world's problems serve primarily to divert our attention from the fundamental problem, and that is the problem of unrestricted exponential growth in a finite system. Can an effective state of global equilibrium be achieved, and if so, what will it take to achieve it? The answer is yes, and here is what the computer indicates it will take to do it. 1. Population must be stabilized worldwide beginning in 1975. 2. Industrial consumption of natural resources must be reduced to 1/4 of its 1970 level beginning in 1975. 3. societal preferences must be shifted from factory-produced material goods to services such as education and health facilities beginning in 1975. 4. Pollution generation must be reduced to 1/4 of its 1970 level beginning in 1975. 5. Capital must be diverted to food production even if it would be considered uneconomic to do so beginning in 1975. 6. All hard goods must be designed and built for maximum durability and ease of repair, beginning in 1975. And finally, industrial capital is allowed to increase naturally until 1990. After that, it too is stabilized by setting the investment rate equal to the depreciation rate. This model run allows a world population only slightly larger than that of today. And while natural resources are gradually depleted, it does allow time for technology to adjust. Industrial output would be at a level 3 times higher than the 1970 world average, but this would be about 1/2 the present U.S. level, or an average income of $1,800 per year. This, then, is what could be achieved and would be physically maintainable according to computer analysis. But, as stated earlier, the results are based upon assumptions that are incredibly optimistic. However, a wait-and-see attitude toward the problem is not possible. A decision to do nothing is a decision to increase the risk of collapse. If society waits until the natural constraints are apparent, it will have waited too long. Human history is, indeed, as H.G. Wells has said, a race between education and catastrophe. Historically, man has many times demonstrated his ability to read the handwriting on the wall when his back is up against it. But the overwhelming evidence is that when our back is against the wall this time, there will not be time enough to turn and read the message.